They say money reveals character, but I never believed it until I watched my own son-in-law crumble under financial pressure that I orchestrated. My name is Virginia Foster, though everyone calls me Ginny, and at 73 years old, I thought I'd seen every shade of human nature. I was wrong. What I discovered about the man my daughter married would change our family forever, and the lengths I went to expose his true character still keep me awake some nights. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about the terrible choices we make when protecting the people we love most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, I've always been the kind of woman who believes in second chances, in seeing the good in people, in building bridges instead of burning them. My late husband Richard used to tease me about it, saying I'd give a stranger the coat off my back in the middle of winter. He wasn't wrong. After he passed, away 12 years ago, leaving me with a substantial fortune from his construction empire, I poured that generosity into my family. I thought love could fix anything, that kindness could soften any heart. I was naive. The day everything changed started like any other Tuesday morning in October. I remember it clearly because the autumn leaves were just beginning to turn, painting my neighborhood in those warm golds and crimsons that always reminded me of Richard's smile. I'd driven over to my daughter Sarah's house to drop off some homemade apple turnovers, her favorite since she was 7 years old. The house I'd helped them buy, I should mention. The mortgage I'd co-signed, the down payment I'd gifted them, as a wedding present 3 years prior. I used my key, something Sarah had insisted I keep for emergencies and impromptu visits. The house was quiet, and I assumed they were both at work. I made my way to the kitchen, planning to leave the turnovers, with a little note when I heard voices coming from the upstairs office. My son-in-law Marcus was on what sounded like a business call, his voice carrying down the hallway with that particular edge he got when discussing money. I should have announced myself. I should have called out that I was there. Instead, something made me pause at the bottom of the stairs, the bag of turnovers still in my hands. Perhaps it was the tone in his voice, sharp and frustrated in a way I'd never heard before. Or maybe it was intuition, that sixth sense that develops after 7 decades of living. "Look, I told you the payment would be late," Marcus was saying, his voice strained. "I'm dealing with some cash flow issues right now, but it's temporary." There was a pause, presumably while the person on the other end responded. I found myself holding my breath, not meaning to eavesdrop but unable to move away. "No, you don't understand," Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly. "My wife's mother is loaded, okay? Like seriously wealthy. The old bat has more money than she knows what to do with. I just need to figure out how to get more of it without seeming too obvious." The words hit me like a physical blow. Old bat. I gripped the banister, my knuckles going white against the dark wood, but he wasn't finished. "Trust me, she's easy to manipulate. All I have to do is play the devoted son-in-law, smile at her boring stories, and pretend to care about her opinions. She eats it up. The woman is desperate for family connection since her husband died. It's actually kind of pathetic." I felt the blood drain from my face. 3 years of birthday dinners where I'd thought we were bonding. 3 years of Sunday. Visits where I'd believed he genuinely enjoyed my company. 3 years of what I'd thought was growing love and mutual respect. "The thing is," Marcus went on, and I could hear him pacing now, his footsteps creaking on the floor above. "She's becoming more of a problem lately, always dropping by unannounced, always wanting to be involved in every little decision we make. Sarah thinks it's sweet, but honestly, the woman is like a cancer. She's everywhere, inserting herself into every aspect of our lives, and I can't make a move without her knowing about it." Cancer. He called me Cancer. I stood there in my daughter's foyer, surrounded by family photos that included my smiling face next to his, and felt something inside me shatter. Not just my heart, though that was certainly broken. But something deeper. My faith in people. Perhaps. My belief that kindness was always met with kindness in return. I need her money, but I need her to back off, Marcus continued. It's like being married to two women, you know? And the mother-in-law is definitely the more controlling one. The person on the other end must have said something amusing because Marcus laughed. A cold, calculated sound I'd never heard from him before. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes I fantasize about what life would be like if the old cancer just disappeared. Sarah would inherit everything, and I wouldn't have to pretend to give a damn about Ginny's garden club stories or her opinions on our landscaping. I set the bag of apple turnovers down on the console table as quietly as I could, my hands shaking. So badly I was afraid I'd drop them. The turnovers I'd woken up early to make because I remembered him mentioning once that he loved cinnamon. The turnovers that were just another small gesture in 3 years of small gestures, all designed to show this man that he was welcome in our family, that he was loved. Look, I've got to go, Marcus said. Sarah will be home soon, and I need to get back to playing the perfect husband. But about that payment, give me 2 weeks. I'll figure something out. The cancer always comes through when we really need it. I heard his footsteps moving across the floor upstairs, and I knew I had perhaps 30 seconds before he came down and found me there. Moving quickly and quietly, I picked up the turnovers and let myself out the front door, my heart pounding, so hard I was sure the entire neighborhood could hear it. I sat in my car for a full 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Cancer. The word echoed in my head with each heartbeat. I thought about all the evenings I'd spent listening to his problems, offering advice about his struggling marketing business, all the times I'd written checks to help with various expenses, always framing it as gifts rather than loans to preserve his pride. The pride that was apparently nothing more than a performance. The business loans I'd co-signed when his company hit rough patches. The credit cards I'd helped pay off when he'd overspent during their honeymoon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The car payment I'd quietly handled for 6 months when he was between contracts. All of it done out of love for Sarah, yes, but also out of genuine affection for the man I'd believed him to be. I drove home slowly, my mind reeling. The beautiful, colonial house that Richard and I had bought 40 years ago felt different when I walked through the door. Emptier somehow, despite being filled with a lifetime of memories. I went straight to my office, the same room where Richard used to manage his business empire, and sat behind the mahogany desk that had been his pride and joy. The framed photographs scattered across the surface told the story of our life together. Richard and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful. Sarah's baby pictures, her graduation photos, her wedding day 3 years ago when I'd been so happy to see her settle down with someone who seemed to adore her. Marcus had given such a beautiful speech that day about how grateful he was to be joining our family, how he promised to take care of Sarah the way Richard had taken care of me. All lies, every word of it, carefully crafted lies. I opened my laptop and began going through financial records, something I hadn't done in months. Since Richard's death, I'd been blessed with the luxury of not having to worry about money. His construction company had been worth millions when he sold it, and his investments had continued to grow even after his passing. I had more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life and still leave Sarah a substantial inheritance. But as I scrolled through bank statements and investment accounts, I realized just how much money had flowed toward Marcus over the past 3 years. It wasn't just the obvious things like the house down payment or the business loans. There were dozens of smaller transactions. The emergency car repair that cost $3,000. The business equipment he'd needed for a big client. The medical bills when he'd claimed his insurance didn't cover a specialist visit. Line by line, I added it up. The total made me gasp out loud. Over the past 3 years, I had given or loaned Marcus and Sarah nearly $200,000. I'd thought I was helping my daughter build a stable life with her husband. Instead, I'd been funding the lifestyle of a man who saw me as nothing more than an ATM with an annoying personality. Attached. The worst part wasn't the money, though that stung. The worst part was the betrayal of trust. The realization that every conversation we'd had, every family dinner, every holiday celebration had been tainted by his deception. When he'd asked about my day, he hadn't cared about the answer. When he'd complimented my cooking, he'd been calculating how much that meal was worth in terms of future financial favors. When he'd hugged me goodbye after visits, he'd been thinking about when he could ask for the next loan. I thought about Sarah, my beautiful, trusting daughter, who had no idea she'd married a man capable of such calculated manipulation. She worked so hard at her job as a pediatric nurse, often pulling extra shifts to help with their expenses. Meanwhile, her husband was on the phone describing her mother as a cancer while plotting to extract more money from the very woman he was disparaging. The question that haunted me as I sat there in Richard's old chair was simple. What was I going to do about it? My first instinct was to march back over to their house and confront Marcus directly, to throw his words back in his face and demand an explanation. But something held me back. Perhaps it was the knowledge that confrontation rarely changes people who are fundamentally dishonest. Or perhaps it was the fear that Sarah would take his side, would find a way to excuse his behavior, or blame me for eavesdropping. No, a direct confrontation would only put him on guard and potentially damage my relationship with Sarah. If I was going to protect my daughter from this man's true nature, I needed to be smarter about it. I spent the rest of that evening thinking about Marcus, really thinking about him for the first time, looking past the charming smile and the polite manners to examine the patterns of his behavior. How he always seemed to have a financial crisis, right around the time of major holidays or family celebrations, ensuring that any gifts or help I offered would seem spontaneous rather than requested. How he managed to make every conversation eventually circle back to his struggles or needs, all while maintaining the facade of being reluctant to accept help. The man was a master manipulator, I realized. The scary thing was how good he was at it. Even now, knowing what I knew, I could see how skillfully he'd played his role. He'd studied me, learned what made me happy, and then performed those actions like an actor following a script. But if Marcus thought he could continue to play me for a fool, he was about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating Virginia Foster. I'd built a life with Richard that was grounded in hard work, integrity, and genuine care for others. After his death, I'd channeled that same energy into supporting my family and various charitable causes around town. I'd served on the hospital board, funded scholarships for local students, and quietly helped dozens of families through difficult times. People in our community knew me as someone who could be counted on, someone who used her resources to make life better for others. What Marcus didn't realize was that all of those activities had given me something invaluable: connections. I knew business owners, bank presidents, lawyers, and accountants. I understood how money flowed through our small city, and more importantly, I understood how to redirect that flow when necessary. Richard used to say that the most dangerous opponent was someone who had nothing left to lose. But I thought there might be something even more dangerous: someone who had everything to lose and the resources to prevent that loss. Marcus wanted to call me a cancer? Fine. But he was about to learn that cancer, when it spreads, can consume everything in its path. I opened a new document on my computer and began to type. Not a plan for revenge exactly, but something more sophisticated. A strategy for revealing truth. If Marcus was the kind of person who showed his real character under financial pressure, then perhaps it was time to apply some pressure and see what emerged. The first step would be to understand exactly how dependent he'd become on my financial support. I began calling in favors, starting with my friend Janet at the bank where Marcus did his business banking. Nothing illegal or unethical, just a general sense of his financial health and credit standing. What I learned was both surprising and not surprising at all. Despite 3 years of steady financial help from me, Marcus was living paycheck to paycheck. His marketing business was legitimate but barely profitable. He had significant credit card debt, a car payment that was higher than necessary for someone in his income bracket, and a lifestyle that consistently outpaced his earnings. Without my regular contributions, he would have been in serious financial trouble long ago. But the most interesting detail Janet shared was about his recent credit applications. Marcus had been shopping for loans using our house, the one I'd helped them buy, as collateral for increasingly risky business ventures. He was planning to leverage my investment in their home to fund expansion plans that seemed overly ambitious for someone with his track record. The picture that emerged was of a man who had not only been deceiving me about his gratitude, but who had been planning to use my generosity as a stepping stone to bigger risks. He saw my money not as gifts from a loving family member, but as seed capital for schemes that could potentially leave Sarah holding the bag if they failed. That night, I called Sarah just to hear her voice. She was tired from a long shift at the hospital, but she still took time to ask about my day and tell me about a particularly challenging case she'd handled with a young patient. Her compassion and dedication shone through every word, just as they always had. She was genuinely good, genuinely caring, and genuinely unaware that her husband saw her inheritance as his financial salvation. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked toward the end of our conversation. "You sound a little distant tonight." I almost told her everything right then. The words were right there, ready to spill out along with all the hurt and anger I was carrying. Instead, I said, "Just tired, sweetheart. You know how it is." "Maybe you should take a vacation," she suggested. "When's the last time you did something just for yourself?" The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was my daughter, working herself to exhaustion to help support a household that was secretly being subsidized by my money, suggesting that I needed to take better care of myself. If she only knew how much of her stress could be eliminated by her husband simply living within his means instead of constantly scheming for more. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my house and made a decision. I couldn't tell Sarah what I'd overheard, not yet. She wouldn't believe me, or worse, she'd confront Marcus and he'd find a way to spin it as a misunderstanding. But I could. Create a situation where his true character would reveal itself naturally, where Sarah would see for herself the kind of man she'd married. It would require patience, careful planning, and a willingness to watch my daughter experience some difficult truths. But sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to remove the illusions that are keeping them trapped in a harmful situation. Marcus thought I was a cancer that he had to tolerate in order to access my money. He was about to discover that this particular cancer had metastasized in ways he never could have imagined. And unlike the disease, I had complete control over how aggressively I chose to spread. The plan that began forming in my mind that night was elegant in its simplicity. I wouldn't destroy Marcus financially. That would be too obvious and might hurt Sarah in the process. Instead, I would gradually remove the safety net he'd become accustomed to, force him to handle his own problems for once, and then watch as the pressure revealed who he really was underneath all that charm. The beautiful thing about teaching someone a lesson through natural consequences is that they can't blame you for the outcome. They can only blame themselves for the choices that led them there. As I finally headed to bed that night, I thought about Richard and what he would have said about the situation. He'd always been protective of Sarah, sometimes overly so, and I knew he would have struggled with the same questions I was facing. How do you protect someone you love from making a mistake without taking away their autonomy to make their own choices? But Richard had also been a businessman, someone who understood that actions have consequences and that sometimes the most educational experiences are the most uncomfortable ones. I thought he would have approved of what I was planning, even if he might have worried about the potential for unintended damage. The last thing I did before turning off the light was to look at the framed photo on my nightstand. Richard and me on our 50th wedding anniversary, just 2 years before he passed. We'd been so happy that day, surrounded by family and friends who genuinely cared about us. People who saw us as more than just sources of financial support or social connections. That's what I wanted for Sarah. I wanted her to experience the kind of marriage Richard and I had shared, built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared values. She deserved better than a man who saw her as a pathway to her mother's money, who talked about her family with contempt when he thought no one was listening. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of teaching Marcus that there are consequences for treating people as means to an end, rather than as human beings worthy of respect. It wouldn't be quick, and it wouldn't be easy, but it would be thorough. After all, I had learned from the best. 45 years of marriage to a successful businessman had taught me a lot about patience, strategy, and the long game. Marcus was about to get a master class in all three. The morning after my world shifted on its axis, I woke with the kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling. The hurt was still there, raw and persistent, but it had crystallized into something harder: purpose. I'd spent 7 decades learning how to read people, how to navigate relationships, how to build and maintain trust. Now it was time to put those skills to a different use. I made my coffee in the same china cup Richard had given me for our 20th anniversary, sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of breakfasts, and began to plan. The morning light streaming through the lace curtains felt different, somehow sharper. Everything felt sharper now that the veil of illusion had been lifted. My first call was to Harold Whitman, my accountant for the past 15 years. Harold had been handling the Foster family finances since before Richard's death, and he knew better than anyone just how generous I'd been with Sarah and Marcus. More importantly, he understood the intricate web of loans, gifts, and co-signed agreements that connected my financial well-being to theirs. "Harold, I need to understand something," I said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "If I were to restructure some of my financial commitments, what would that look like, practically speaking?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Harold was nothing if not discreet, but he'd been managing money long enough to recognize the tone of someone preparing for a significant change. "Are you experiencing some difficulties, Virginia? Because if you need to liquidate assets or adjust your portfolio, we can certainly explore options." "No difficulties on my end," I assured him. "But I'm reconsidering some of the support I've been providing to family members. I want to understand what my legal obligations are versus what I've been doing out of generosity." Another pause, this one longer. "I see. Well, let me pull up your files and we can go through everything systematically. Are you available to come in this afternoon?" By 3 o'clock, I was sitting in Harold's downtown office, surrounded by manila folders that contained the financial history of my relationship with Marcus. The numbers were even more staggering when laid out in spreadsheets and categorized by type of assistance. Harold had prepared a comprehensive overview that made my informal mental calculations from the night before look conservative. The business. "Loans are the most complex," Harold explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he pointed to a particular column of figures. "You've co-signed for approximately $87,000 in business credit lines and equipment financing. Legally, you're on the hook for these if Marcus defaults, but there's no obligation for you to continue making payments on his behalf." I'd been making those payments for 8 months, I realized, ever since Marcus had mentioned cash flow problems in his marketing business. 8 months of quietly handling obligations that weren't technically mine, all to preserve his pride and maintain family harmony. "The personal loans are more straightforward," Harold continued. "Most of these were structured as gifts for tax purposes, so there's no legal obligation for repayment. The mortgage assistance, the car payments, the credit card help, all gifts, according to our documentation." "What about the house?" I asked. "My name is on the deed as a co-owner, isn't it?" Harold nodded. "You provided the entire down payment and you're listed as owning 30% of the property. Sarah and Marcus hold the remaining 70% jointly. If you wanted to, you could demand your share of the equity, but that would likely force a sale. The house was worth considerably more now than when they'd purchased it 3 years ago. The neighborhood had gentrified, property values had risen, and the renovations I'd helped fund had increased its value even further. My 30% stake was worth nearly $120,000 at current market rates. "Harold, I want you to prepare some documents for me," I said slowly. "Nothing drastic, nothing that would cause immediate hardship, but I want to understand my options if I decide to. Adjust the level of support I've been providing." Over. The next 2 hours, we developed what Harold diplomatically called a financial independence plan. It was designed to gradually wean Marcus off my financial support while protecting Sarah from any immediate consequences. The business loan payments would continue for now, but I would begin the process of removing myself as a co-signer. The monthly assistance with various bills would be phased out over several months. Most importantly, any new requests for financial help would be subjected to formal documentation and repayment schedules. "Virginia," Harold said as I prepared to leave. "I hope you don't mind my asking, but what's prompted this change? You've been so generous with your family, and from what I've observed, it's brought you a lot of joy." I paused in the doorway of his office, considering how much to reveal. Harold had known Richard and me for years. He'd seen us through the grief of Richard's illness, the complexity of settling his estate, and the joy I'd felt in being able to help Sarah start her married life on solid financial ground. "Sometimes generosity becomes enabling," I said finally, "and sometimes the people we're trying to help need to learn to help themselves." Harold nodded slowly. "I understand. Well, if you need any adjustments to this plan, just let me know." "And Virginia? For what it's worth, I think you're making a wise decision. Financial independence is important for everyone, family included." Driving home, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation. The sadness was for the loss of innocence, the end of my naive belief that everyone in my family shared the same values of mutual respect and genuine care. The anticipation was harder to define, but it felt like the way I'd felt before, important. Business presentations back when I'd worked alongside Richard, the focused energy that comes from knowing you're about to test your skills against a worthy challenge. That evening, I did something I rarely did anymore. I called my sister Eleanor in Florida. Eleanor was 5 years older than me, sharper around the edges, and had always been more skeptical of people's motives. She'd liked Marcus well enough when she met him at Sarah's wedding, but she'd made a few comments afterward that I'd dismissed as typical Eleanor pessimism. "Ginny, what a surprise," she said when she heard my voice. "Is everything all right? You sound different." "I need some advice, Ellie, about family dynamics." There was a pause, and when Eleanor spoke again, her voice had shifted into what our mother used to call her big sister mode. "What's Sarah's husband done now?" The question was so direct, so immediately on target that I almost laughed. "What makes you think this is about Marcus? Because you've called him Sarah's husband instead of using his name, and because you've got that tone in your voice that you used to get when the neighborhood kids were picking on Sarah in elementary school. Protective and plotting." "So what did he do?" I told her everything. The overheard phone conversation, the financial analysis with Harold, the growing realization that I'd been systematically manipulated for 3 years. Eleanor listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of disgust or disapproval, but mostly just letting me talk through the whole situation. "That calculating little weasel," she said when I finished. "Ginny, I'm so sorry. I know how much you wanted to believe the best of him." "The worst part is how good he is at it," I admitted. "Even knowing what I know, when I think back to our interactions, I can see how skillfully he managed every conversation, every request, every expression of gratitude. It was all performance. The question now is what you do about it. Are you going to tell Sarah?" I'd been wrestling with this question since the previous night. I don't think she'd believe me. She loves him, Ellie, and he's been just as careful with her as he has with me. She sees the charming, attentive husband. She has no idea about the phone calls or the way he talks about our family when she's not around. So, what's your plan? I explained Harold's financial independence strategy, the gradual withdrawal of support, the documentation of future requests. Eleanor listened thoughtfully. That's smart, she said when I finished, but it might not be enough. Men like Marcus, they adapt. He'll find other ways to manipulate the situation, other pressure points to exploit. You need to be prepared for him to escalate his game. What do you mean? I mean he might start putting pressure on Sarah to pressure you, create problems that only you can solve, manufacture crises that require immediate family support. He's been studying you for 3 years, Ginny. He knows which buttons to push. Eleanor's words haunted me for the rest of the evening. She was right, of course. Marcus had demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of family dynamics and emotional manipulation. Simply cutting off the money wouldn't necessarily reveal his true character to Sarah. It might just make him more creative in his approaches. The next morning brought the first test of my new resolve. Sarah called while I was having breakfast, her voice tight with stress. Mom, I hate to ask, but we've got a situation with the roof. The contractor found some structural damage that wasn't visible during the initial inspection, and insurance won't cover it because they're calling it pre-existing. We need $8,000 by Friday, or we can't complete the repairs before the weather gets worse. It was perfectly plausible. October was indeed a bad time for roofing problems, and insurance companies were notorious for finding reasons to deny claims. The timeline was tight but not impossible. The amount was significant, but not outrageous for structural repairs. It was also exactly the kind of crisis Eleanor had predicted Marcus might manufacture. That sounds stressful, sweetheart, I said carefully. Have you gotten a second opinion on the repair estimate? There was a slight pause. Well, no, but Marcus knows this contractor from his business networking group. He's reliable, and he's fitting us into his schedule as a favor. If we wait to get other estimates, we might not be able to get anyone else out there before winter. The networking group detail was a nice touch. It provided just enough context to make the story believable while creating urgency that would discourage too many questions. But something about Sarah's tone bothered me. She sounded like she was reciting talking points rather than expressing her own concerns. Sarah, can I ask you something? How exactly did this damage get discovered? Was this contractor already working on your roof? Another pause. Longer this time. We had him come out to give us an estimate for some minor repairs, and he noticed the structural issues while he was up there. Mom, I know $8,000 is a lot, but if we don't handle this now, it could turn into a much bigger problem. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. My daughter, my honest, straightforward daughter, was lying to me. Not skillfully, not comfortably, but she was definitely not telling me the complete truth. Which meant Marcus had already begun the next phase of his manipulation, using Sarah as his intermediary. Of course I'll help, I said, and I heard the relief in Sarah's voice immediately. But I'm going to handle this a little differently than usual. I'll pay the contractor directly, and I'll need to see the detailed estimate and a copy of the insurance denial letter for my records. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Mom, are you still there? I'm here, sweetheart. I said I'll pay the contractor directly and I'll need the documentation. That's just good financial practice for larger expenditures. Oh, okay. I mean, of course that makes sense. I'll have Marcus get you all the paperwork. Thank you so much, Mom. I was really worried about how we were going to handle this. After we hung up, I sat staring at my coffee cup for a long time. Sarah's discomfort with my request for documentation told me everything I needed to know. There might indeed be roof problems, Marcus was too smart to fabricate something that could be easily disproven. But the crisis atmosphere, the tight timeline, and the specific dollar amount were all carefully orchestrated. I called Harold immediately. "I need you to prepare a check for $8,000, I told him. "But I want it made out to a roofing contractor, not to Sarah or Marcus. And I want you to require documentation before releasing the funds. Detailed estimates, insurance correspondence, the works." "Understood. Should I explain this as a new policy for all family financial assistance?" "Exactly. Tell them I'm updating my approach to family gifts for tax and estate planning purposes. Make it sound like routine financial management, not a specific response to this request." "Very good. And Virginia? This is smart policy regardless of the circumstances. Documentation protects everyone involved." The next few days were revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Marcus called me directly for the first time in months, his voice warm and apologetic. "Virginia, I want to personally thank you for helping us with the roof situation. Sarah was so stressed about it, and your willingness to step in means the world to both of us." "Of course, Marcus. Family takes care of family." "Absolutely. And I hope you don't mind the new paperwork requirements. Harold explained it's for estate planning purposes, which makes perfect sense. We'll get you everything you need by tomorrow." His tone was exactly right. Grateful but not obsequious. Understanding about the documentation requirements, focused on family values. If I hadn't overheard that phone call, I would have been completely convinced by his sincerity. The paperwork, when it arrived, was comprehensive and convincing. The roofing estimate looked professional. The insurance denial letter appeared legitimate, and the timeline still seemed urgent. But something nagged at me about the contractor's business address, so I decided to drive by and take a look. The address led me to a small strip mall on the outskirts of town. The suite number on the estimate corresponded to a mail forwarding service, not an actual contracting business. There was no signage, no evidence of any roofing company operating from that location. I sat in my car in that strip mall parking lot and felt a cold rage settle over me. Marcus hadn't just manufactured a crisis to extract money from me. He'd involved Sarah in an outright fraud, convinced her to lie to her own mother, and put her in a position where she could potentially face legal consequences if his scheme was discovered by authorities. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about my daughter's integrity, her reputation, and her future. Marcus was willing to risk all of that to maintain his comfortable lifestyle funded by my generosity. That evening, I called Sarah and asked if she could come over for dinner the next night. "Just the two of us," I said, because I hadn't had quality time with her in weeks. She agreed eagerly, mentioning that Marcus had a business dinner anyway, so the timing worked perfectly. I spent the next day preparing Sarah's favorite meal, pot roast with all the traditional sides, the same dinner I'd made for her countless times throughout her childhood. Comfort food for what I suspected might be an uncomfortable conversation. Sarah arrived looking tired and a little stressed, which wasn't unusual given her demanding job at the hospital. But there was something else in her demeanor, a guarded quality I'd never seen before. She hugged me at the door with the same warmth as always, but I sensed she was holding something back. Over dinner, we talked about her work, my garden, mutual, friends from church, all the safe topics that had always come easily between us. But I noticed she steered the conversation away from anything related to her home life or financial situation. When I mentioned the roof repairs, she gave brief, almost rehearsed answers and quickly changed the subject. After we finished eating, I made tea and we settled in the living room, surrounded by photos and mementos from Sarah's childhood. This was where we'd always had our most important conversations, where I'd helped her through heartbreaks and celebrated her achievements. "Sarah," I said gently, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I saw her shoulders tense slightly, though she tried to hide it. "Of course, Mom. What is it?" "The roofing contractor you're using. Have you met him personally?" The question clearly wasn't what she'd been expecting. She looked confused, then slightly relieved, then confused again. Met him personally? Well, no, not exactly. Marcus has been handling all the contractor communications because he understands construction better than I do. Why? I drove by the business address on the estimate. It's a mail forwarding service, not a contracting office. The color drained from Sarah's face so quickly I was afraid she might faint. She stared at me for a long moment, her mouth opening and closing as if she was trying to find words that wouldn't come. That can't be right, Marcus said. She trailed off, and I could see the pieces clicking together in her mind. The realization that she'd been used, that she'd unknowingly participated in deceiving me, that the man she'd trusted had put her in an impossible position. "Oh, God," she whispered, her hands covering her face. "Mom, I swear I didn't know. Marcus told me the contractor was legitimate, that he'd worked with him before. I never thought to question it." I moved to sit beside her on the couch, putting my arm around her shoulders the way I had when she was a child facing some disappointment or betrayal. "I know you didn't know, sweetheart. That's not why I'm telling you this." "Then why?" She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Why are you telling me my husband is lying to both of us?" It was the opening I'd been hoping for, the moment when Sarah's own sense of right and wrong would make her receptive to larger truths. But I also knew I had to be careful. Too much too fast, and she might retreat into defensiveness or denial. "Because I think there might be other things you don't know," I said carefully. "And because I love you too much to watch you be taken advantage of, even by someone you love." Over the next hour, I told Sarah about my discoveries over the past few days. Not the overheard phone call, that felt too much like an ambush, but the pattern of financial dependence I'd uncovered, the legitimate contractors I'd called who had no record of any work requests for their address, the insurance company that had no record of a claim denial. Sarah listened in growing horror as the scope of Marcus's deception became clear. Not just the current roof scam, but a pattern of manufactured crises designed to extract money from me while keeping Sarah in the dark about the extent of their financial dependence. "I feel so stupid," she said finally, wiping her eyes with the tissue I'd handed her. "I should have known. I should have asked more questions." "You trusted your husband," I replied. "That's not stupid, that's normal. The problem isn't that you trusted him. The problem is that he's not worthy of that trust." "What do I do now? Mom, how do I go home and face him knowing what I know?" It was the question I'd been dreading, because the answer would determine whether my plan to reveal Marcus's true character would succeed or backfire spectacularly. "You don't confront him directly," I said after a long pause. "Not yet. He's been manipulating this situation for too long, and he's too good at it. If you give him advance warning, he'll find a way to explain everything, to make you question your own perceptions. Then what?" "We're going to set a trap," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "We're going to create a situation where his true priorities become impossible to hide, where he has to choose between his own interests and your well-being. And we're going to make sure you see exactly what choice he makes." Sarah stared at me with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Mom, that sounds manipulative." "Yes," I agreed. "It does. But sometimes manipulation is the only way to reveal the truth about someone who's been manipulating you." We spent another hour planning, discussing possibilities, considering potential consequences. Sarah was reluctant at first, torn between her loyalty to her marriage and her growing awareness of how thoroughly she'd been deceived. But as we talked through the details of Marcus's various schemes, her anger began to overcome her doubt. "He used me," she said finally, her voice hard in a way I'd rarely heard. "He made me lie to you, Mom. He put me in a position where I was helping him steal from my own mother." "Yes, he did. The question now is whether you want to find out what else he's been willing to do, or whether you want to spend the rest of your marriage wondering what's real and what's performance. When Sarah left that night, we had an agreement. She would continue to act normally around Marcus, pretending she believed his explanations about the roof contractor. Meanwhile, I would begin implementing a more comprehensive version of my financial independence plan, one designed to create the kind of pressure that would force Marcus to reveal his true character. But as I watched her drive away, I felt a pang of doubt about what we were setting in motion. Was I protecting my daughter, or was I manipulating her as surely as Marcus had been? Was I teaching him a necessary lesson, or was I indulging in sophisticated revenge? The questions followed me to bed that night and lingered in my dreams. But when I woke the next morning, my resolve was stronger than ever. Sometimes love requires difficult choices. Sometimes protecting someone means forcing them to see truths they'd rather avoid. Marcus had gambled that he could continue to manipulate both Sarah and me indefinitely, that his charm and our love for him would always overcome any inconvenient questions about his behavior. He was about to learn that some gambles have consequences no amount of charm can overcome. The next phase of my plan would require patience, careful timing, and a willingness to watch Marcus struggle as the financial safety net I'd provided slowly disappeared. But it would also require something more challenging: the strength to watch Sarah's heart break as she discovered the full extent of her husband's betrayal. As I sat with my morning coffee, looking out at the autumn garden Richard and I had planted together so many years ago, I made a silent promise to both of them. I would see this through to the end, whatever that end might be. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses, even when that someone is family. The transformation in Sarah over the next few weeks was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had watched her grow from a curious toddler into a compassionate woman. She carried herself differently now, with a wariness that hadn't been there before. During our regular phone calls, I could hear her choosing her words more carefully, especially when Marcus was within earshot. We had developed a simple code during one of our clandestine coffee meetings at a cafe across town. If she said she was tired from work, it meant Marcus had attempted another financial manipulation. If she mentioned having a headache, it meant she'd caught him in a lie. The frequency of both coded messages was increasing at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, I had begun implementing what Harold and I had dubbed Operation Financial Reality. It was a carefully orchestrated withdrawal of the various forms of support that had become pillars of Marcus and Sarah's lifestyle. Each reduction was introduced with a plausible explanation, spaced out over time to avoid appearing punitive or coordinated. The first to go was my monthly contribution to their utility bills. I explained to Sarah that my financial advisor had recommended consolidating my charitable giving to maximize tax benefits, and that meant reducing some of the informal family assistance. She accepted this explanation easily, probably because Marcus hadn't told her I'd been covering nearly $400 monthly in electricity, gas, and water bills. Next was the gradual cessation of my habit of picking up restaurant tabs during family dinners. Instead of automatically reaching for the check, I began suggesting we split it, or allowing Marcus to pay. The change in his demeanor during these moments was fascinating to observe. The easy charm would flicker slightly, replaced by a barely perceptible tightness around his eyes as he calculated whether the cost of dinner was worth maintaining his facade. But the most effective pressure point was my decision to stop making payments on the business loan I'd co-signed. Harold had structured this carefully, ensuring I remained legally protected while forcing Marcus to resume responsibility for his own obligations. The monthly payment was significant enough that its absence would create immediate cash flow problems, but not so large as to trigger an immediate default. The first sign that my strategy was working came 3 weeks into Operation Financial Reality. Sarah called me on a Thursday evening, her voice strained in a way that told me Marcus was nearby and she couldn't speak freely. "Mom, I'm really tired from work today," she said, using our agreed-upon signal. This patient load has been incredibly demanding, and I'm getting these terrible headaches from the stress. Both codes in one sentence. Marcus had tried something new, and Sarah had caught him lying about it. "I'm sorry to hear that, sweetheart," I replied, playing my part. "Maybe you should take some time this weekend to rest. We could have lunch on Saturday, just the two of us." That would be wonderful. I really need some quiet time to decompress. Saturday's lunch meeting took place at a small bistro in the next town over, far enough from our usual haunts to ensure privacy. Sarah arrived looking genuinely exhausted, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent questioning everything she thought she knew about her marriage. "He's getting desperate," she said without preamble, sliding into the booth across from me. "Mom, the things he's been saying, the stories he's been telling. I don't know how I ever believed any of it." She told me about Marcus's latest scheme, a complex tale involving a business opportunity that required immediate investment capital. According to his story, a former client had offered him a partnership in a lucrative marketing contract, but the deal required Marcus to front $50,000 as a good-faith investment. The returns would be substantial, he claimed, enough to pay me back with interest and establish financial independence for their family. "He had documents," Sarah said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Official-looking contracts, projected earnings, reports, references from supposed business associates. It all looked so professional, so legitimate." "But you questioned it?" "I asked to meet the client, to see the business premises, to understand exactly what services we'd be providing. Every question I asked, Marcus had an excuse for why that wasn't possible right now. The client was traveling. The office was being renovated. The details were confidential until the contracts were signed." Sarah's newfound skepticism was both heartening and heartbreaking. Heartening because it meant she was finally seeing through Marcus's manipulations. Heartbreaking because it meant the death of her innocence, her faith in the man she'd pledged to spend her life with. "When I pressed him for more information," she continued, "he got angry in a way I've never seen before. Not shouting or aggressive, but cold, calculating. He told me I was being paranoid and suspicious, that I was sabotaging our future because I couldn't trust him to make good business decisions." This was the Marcus I'd heard on that phone call, the one who saw obstacles to his plans as problems to be managed rather than legitimate concerns to be addressed. Sarah was finally getting a glimpse of the man behind the charm. "There's something else," she said, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "I think he's been going through my purse, checking my phone, monitoring my activities. Little things are moved around, apps on my phone are open that I didn't open. My work schedule seems to be information he knows before I tell him." The controlling behavior was escalating, which meant my pressure campaign was having the desired effect. Marcus was losing confidence in his ability to manage the situation through charm alone, so he was resorting to more direct methods of control. "Sarah, I need you to be very careful," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Men like Marcus can become unpredictable when they feel cornered. Promise me you won't confront him directly about any of this." "I won't, but Mom, I can't keep living like this. Every conversation feels like a performance. Every request for information feels like an interrogation. I'm walking on eggshells in my own home." It was exactly the outcome I'd hoped for, but seeing my daughter's pain made me question whether the end justified the means. Was I protecting her from a manipulative husband, or was I destroying her marriage to prove a point about his character? The answer came sooner than I expected, in a form that removed any doubt about the necessity of what we were doing. The following Tuesday, I received a call from Janet at the bank. Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the concern underneath her professional demeanor. "Virginia, I need to inform you about some activity on accounts where you're listed as a co-signer or authorized user. There have been several large transactions in the past week that I thought you should be aware of." My blood ran cold. "What kind of transactions?" "Cash advances against credit lines, transfers between accounts, applications for additional credit using your co-signed agreements as collateral. Nothing illegal, technically, but unusual enough that our fraud prevention protocols flagged them for review. Marcus was liquidating every available source of credit, using my financial backing to extract cash from accounts I'd co-signed years ago during his various business ventures. The amounts Janet described totaled nearly $30,000, money that legally I was responsible for if he defaulted. Janet, I need you to freeze my authorization on all joint accounts immediately. Remove my name from anything that allows him to access credit or transfer funds. I can initiate that process, but Virginia, you should know that some of these transactions have already cleared. And there's something else. He's been making inquiries about your personal accounts, asking about your investment portfolio, your retirement funds, property holdings. Nothing he can access legally, but he's clearly trying to understand the full scope of your assets. After hanging up with Janet, I sat in my office staring at the phone for a long time. Marcus wasn't just stealing from me anymore. He was conducting reconnaissance on my entire financial situation, presumably preparing for some larger scheme that would require knowledge of my complete asset base. I called Harold immediately and filled him in on Janet's report. His response was swift and decisive. "We need to protect your assets immediately," he said. "I'm going to recommend some trust structures and account changes that will make it impossible for anyone to access your funds without explicit written authorization. This goes beyond normal family financial planning, Virginia. This is asset protection from potential fraud." The legal terminology made it real in a way that our previous conversations hadn't. We weren't talking about teaching Marcus a lesson anymore. We were talking about protecting myself from criminal activity. That evening, Sarah called with another coded message, this one more urgent than any before. "Mom, I'm having the worst headache of my life," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I think I need to see a doctor. Maybe I could stay with you tonight, just to rest in a quiet environment?" Marcus had escalated his behavior to the point where Sarah felt unsafe in her own home. Whatever had happened, it was serious enough that she was ready to leave, at least temporarily. "Of course, sweetheart. Come over whenever you're ready. Do you need me to pick you up?" "No, I can drive. I'll be there in an hour." Sarah arrived with a small overnight bag and a hollow look in her eyes that told me everything I needed to know. Whatever veneer of normalcy had remained in her marriage was gone. She collapsed onto my couch and began to cry with the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose world has just shattered completely. I held her the way I had when she was a child, stroking her hair and murmuring comforting words while she grieved for the marriage she'd thought she had. When the crying finally subsided, the story came out in fragments. Marcus had confronted her about her suspicious behavior and secret meetings with me. He'd accused her of conspiring against him, of undermining their marriage by questioning his business decisions and financial plans. "He knew about our lunch meetings," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "He knew about the cafe the time we met, even what I ordered. He's been following me, Mom, or having me followed." The surveillance was disturbing enough, but what happened next was worse. When Sarah refused to provide details about our conversations, Marcus had become verbally abusive in a way she'd never experienced. "He called me names I won't repeat," she said quietly. "He told me I was stupid and gullible, that I was letting you poison my mind against him. He said I was choosing my mother over my husband, and that no man would tolerate that kind of betrayal." "Sarah, that's emotional abuse. You know that, right?" She nodded slowly. "I know. But Mom, the worst part wasn't the names or the accusations. The worst part was how calculated it felt. Like he'd planned exactly what to say to hurt me most. Exactly which insecurities to target. It felt like he'd been studying me, learning my weaknesses so he could use them against me when necessary. This was the Marcus I'd always suspected existed beneath the charm. The man who saw relationships as strategic advantages, who cataloged emotional vulnerabilities like weapons to be deployed when needed. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "He demanded access to my inheritance documents, my life insurance policies, anything that shows my financial worth separate from his. He said if I trusted him, I'd make him a beneficiary on everything, that married couples shouldn't have financial secrets from each other." The inheritance discussion was the final piece of evidence I needed to understand Marcus's long-term strategy. He wasn't just manipulating me for current financial support. He was positioning himself to benefit from Sarah's eventual inheritance, ensuring that my money would flow to him regardless of whether our relationship remained intact. "He's been planning this from the beginning, hasn't he?" Sarah asked, reading my expression. "The whole marriage, the whole courtship, everything was about gaining access to our family's money." I wanted to deny it, to soften the blow somehow, but Sarah deserved the truth. "I think so, sweetheart. I think he saw you as a pathway to financial security, and me as a resource to be managed and exploited." We sat in silence for a long time, both processing the full scope of Marcus's deception. 3 years of marriage, all built on a foundation of lies and calculated manipulation. 3 years of Sarah's genuine love and trust being weaponized against her own family. What do I do now, Mom? How do I rebuild my life from this? It was the question I'd been dreading, because the answer would require Sarah to make some incredibly difficult choices. Leaving Marcus would mean acknowledging that her marriage had been a fraud, that she'd been victimized by someone she'd trusted completely. Staying would mean accepting a relationship built on deception and manipulation. "First, you stay here as long as you need to feel safe," I said. "Then we consult with a lawyer about protecting your assets and understanding your legal options. And then you decide what kind of future you want, independent of what Marcus wants or expects. Will you help me? Every step of the way." The next morning brought a development I hadn't anticipated. Marcus called my house at 7 a.m., his voice smooth and concerned in a way that would have fooled me completely just a few weeks earlier. "Virginia, I'm so worried about Sarah," he said. "She left last night after we had a small disagreement and she's not answering her phone. Is she with you? I just want to make sure she's safe." Small disagreement. The manipulation was breathtaking, in its audacity. "She's fine, Marcus. She needed some space to think, and she felt comfortable coming here. I appreciate you taking care of her, but I think there might be some misunderstanding about our conversation last night. Sarah was upset about some work stress, and I'm afraid she may have misinterpreted some things I said. Could I come over and talk with both of you? I'd really like to clear the air." The request was reasonable on its surface, but I could hear the desperation underneath his calm exterior. He needed to regain control of the narrative, to explain away Sarah's newfound awareness of his true nature. "I don't think that's a good idea right now, Marcus. Sarah needs time to process her feelings, and your presence might be overwhelming for her." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, some of the smoothness had gone out of his voice. "Virginia, with all due respect, Sarah is my wife. Whatever problems we're having, they should be resolved between us, not influenced by outside parties. I think you're overstepping your role here." There it was, the first crack in his facade of respect and gratitude. When charm and manipulation failed, Marcus defaulted to asserting control through claimed authority. "Marcus, Sarah is an adult who can make her own decisions about where she stays and whom she talks to. She's chosen to be here, and I'm going to respect that choice." "I see." His voice was cold now, stripped of any pretense of warmth. "I hope you realize what you're doing to our family, Virginia. Sometimes trying to help actually makes things worse." The thinly veiled threat was exactly what I'd expected. Marcus was revealing his true character piece by piece, each conversation stripping away another layer of the persona he'd maintained for 3 years. After hanging up, I found Sarah in the kitchen making coffee with shaking hands. She'd heard my side of the conversation, and her face was pale with a mixture of fear and anger. "He's going to blame you for everything, isn't he?" she said. "He's going to make this about interference from my overbearing mother instead of taking responsibility for his own behavior." "Probably. But Sarah, that's exactly why we needed to force this confrontation. Would you rather spend the next 10 years wondering whether his love was real, or deal with the truth now while you're still young enough to build a different life?" She considered this for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at the garden where she'd played as a child. "I keep thinking about all the red flags I ignored," she said finally. "The way he always steered conversations away from his past, his family, his previous relationships. How he never seemed to have close friends or long-term business partnerships. The way he charmed everyone initially but never developed deeper connections with people. Those weren't your fault, sweetheart. Manipulative people are skilled at hiding their true nature, especially from the people they're targeting. But I should have trusted my instincts. There were moments, especially early in our relationship, when something felt off, when his responses to questions seemed rehearsed, or when his emotions didn't quite match the situation. I told myself I was being paranoid. This was the hardest part of healing from manipulation, I knew. The victims often blamed themselves for not seeing through the deception, for allowing themselves to be vulnerable to someone who didn't deserve their trust. Over the next few days, Sarah and I developed a routine that felt like a return to simpler times. She would leave for work each morning from my house, and we'd have dinner together each evening, talking through her feelings and planning for her future. Marcus called repeatedly, his messages growing progressively more desperate and angry as his attempts to regain control failed. By the end of the week, his true nature was on full display. The charming, respectful son-in-law had been replaced by someone who left voicemails accusing me of destroying his marriage, threatening legal action for alienation of affection, and demanding that Sarah return home immediately or face financial consequences. The financial threats were particularly revealing. Marcus had apparently assumed that Sarah's dependence on their shared lifestyle would force her to overlook his behavior. He'd calculated that the comfort I'd helped provide would be a chain binding her to him, regardless of how poorly he treated her. He was about to learn that some things are more valuable than financial security, and that love based on manipulation is ultimately worthless compared to the genuine support of family who actually care about your well-being. But I also knew that the hardest part of our journey was still ahead. Marcus had invested 3 years in this relationship, and men like him don't give up easily when their investment is threatened. The pressure tactics and emotional manipulation would likely escalate before he finally accepted that his scheme had failed. Sarah was stronger than he'd given her credit for, but she was also grieving the loss of the man she'd thought she'd married. The coming weeks would test her resolve in ways that might make her question whether the truth was worth the pain of accepting it. As I watched her reading in my living room that evening, surrounded by the same books and family photos that had comforted her throughout her childhood, I felt a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride in her courage to face difficult truths, sorrow for the innocence she'd had to sacrifice to protect herself from someone who should have cherished and protected her. The web Marcus had woven around our family was unraveling strand by strand, but I suspected the most dramatic revelations were still to come. Men like him always had contingency plans, backup strategies for when their primary approach failed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts at manipulation, new tests of our resolve to choose truth over comfortable illusions. But for tonight, Sarah was safe, and that was enough. The morning that changed everything started with Marcus, standing on my front porch at 6:30 a.m., still wearing yesterday's clothes and carrying what appeared to be a hastily packed suitcase. Through the window, I could see his car parked at an odd angle in my driveway, as if he'd arrived in a hurry and hadn't bothered to straighten it properly. Sarah was still asleep upstairs, having finally managed a full night's rest for the first time in weeks. The dark circles under her eyes had begun to fade, and she'd started eating normally again instead of picking at her food like someone recovering from a long illness. Seeing her slowly return to herself had reinforced my conviction that exposing Marcus's true nature was worth whatever unpleasantness lay ahead. I opened the door before he could ring the bell and wake Sarah, stepping onto the porch and closing the door firmly behind me. Marcus looked haggard in a way I'd never seen before, his usually immaculate appearance replaced by stubble, wrinkled clothes, and bloodshot eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and too much alcohol. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice rough and strained. Gone was any pretense of politeness or respect. This was Marcus stripped of his carefully maintained facade, and the result was both pathetic and frightening. About what? I kept my voice level and calm, though my heart was racing. Something fundamental had shifted in him overnight, and I wasn't sure what to expect. About what you've done to my marriage. About how you've poisoned Sarah against me with your lies and manipulation. About how you're going to fix this situation before it destroys everything I've worked for. The accusations were delivered with a cold fury that made me understand why Sarah had felt unsafe in her own home. This wasn't the charming man who had wooed my daughter or the grateful son-in-law who had thanked me for countless acts of generosity. This was someone whose mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator underneath. "I haven't told Sarah any lies, Marcus. I've simply stopped enabling your deception." Deception? His laugh was bitter and harsh. What deception? Accepting help from family? Trying to build a stable life for your daughter? Everything I've done has been for Sarah's benefit. Including stealing $30,000 from accounts I co-signed? Including creating fake contracting companies to defraud me? Including emotionally abusing my daughter when she started asking reasonable questions about your behavior? Marcus's face went through a series of expressions as he processed my words. Surprise that I knew about the financial theft, calculation as he considered how to respond, and finally, a cold rage that made me grateful for the solid door between him and Sarah. "You don't understand the pressures I'm under," he said, his voice taking on a wheedling quality that was somehow more disturbing than the anger. "The business has been struggling, and I needed capital to invest in opportunities that would benefit all of us. Everything I borrowed, I fully intended to pay back with interest once the deals came through." "What deals, Marcus? The $50,000 investment opportunity that Sarah researched and found to be completely fabricated? The roofing contractor who doesn't exist? How many other fictional business ventures have you used to justify stealing from your own family?" The question seemed to hit him like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment, I saw not the charming manipulator or the cold-eyed predator, but a desperate man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "You don't know what it's like," he said quietly, staring at the ground instead of meeting my eyes. "Growing up with nothing, watching other people live comfortable lives while you struggle for every scrap. When I met Sarah, when I saw what your family had, I thought I'd finally found my chance to be somebody. To have the kind of life I'd always dreamed of. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the phone conversation I'd overheard, the casual cruelty with which he'd described me, the way he'd been willing to destroy Sarah's relationship with her own mother to maintain his access to our family's resources. "Marcus, if you'd been honest from the beginning, if you'd told us about your struggles and your goals, we would have helped you." Richard and I came from humble backgrounds too. We understood what it meant to work for everything you had. But what you did instead was build a relationship based on lies and manipulation. Lies? His anger flared again, but this time it seemed more desperate than threatening. "I love Sarah. That was never a lie. Everything I did was to give her a better life. You love what Sarah represents. You love the financial security she provided, the social status of being part of our family, the comfortable lifestyle my generosity made possible. But you don't love Sarah herself because you've never bothered to truly know her. That's not true, isn't it? Tell me something about my daughter that isn't related to her appearance, her family connections, or her potential inheritance. Tell me about her dreams, her fears, her values, her hopes for the future that don't involve money. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The silence stretched between us as he apparently realized he couldn't answer the challenge. After 3 years of marriage, he knew Sarah's bank account balance better than he knew her heart. "You've destroyed everything," he said finally, his voice flat and defeated. 3 years of building a life together, and you've destroyed it all because you couldn't stand to see Sarah happy with someone who wasn't good enough for your standards. I destroyed a house of cards, Marcus, a relationship built on deception, and manipulation was never going to last. I just accelerated the inevitable. What do you want from me? The question came out as a whisper, and I realized he was finally ready to negotiate rather than demand. The financial pressure, the exposure of his schemes, and Sarah's growing awareness of his true nature had broken down his defenses completely. I want you to leave Sarah alone. I want you to stop the emotional manipulation, the financial schemes, the attempts to control and intimidate her. I want you to let her rebuild her life without interference from you. And if I do that, if I agree to a divorce, sign whatever papers she wants, disappear from your lives completely, what happens to me then? It was a fair question, and one I'd been considering for weeks. Marcus was undeniably a victim of his own choices, but he was also a human being who would have to live with the consequences of those choices long after this crisis passed. That depends on whether you're willing to change, I said. The business, loans you took under false pretenses, the credit card fraud, the theft from joint accounts, those are criminal matters that could be prosecuted if the victims chose to press charges. But they're also debts that could be forgiven if restitution is made and genuine remorse is shown. Restitution? I don't have $30,000 to pay you back. My business is failing, my credit is destroyed, and after this divorce, I'll have nothing. Then you'll have to rebuild, honestly, this time. Get a job, live within your means, pay back what you owe in installments over time. Learn to base your self-worth on something other than the lifestyle you can afford, or the family connections you can exploit. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. He could continue fighting, escalating his attempts to manipulate and control the situation. He could try to win Sarah back through some combination of charm and emotional blackmail. Or he could accept that his scheme had failed and try to salvage what little dignity he had left. How do I know you won't prosecute anyway, even if I cooperate? How do I know this isn't just another way to manipulate me? It was a reasonable concern, and one that revealed he understood manipulation well enough to recognize it in others. Because, unlike you, I don't make promises I don't intend to keep. If you leave Sarah alone, make genuine restitution for what you've stolen, and disappear from our lives voluntarily, I'll consider the matter closed. But if you continue to harass or threaten either of us, I'll use every legal resource at my disposal to protect my family. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening behind me. Sarah stepped onto the porch wearing my old bathrobe, her hair tousled from sleep but her eyes alert and wary. I heard voices, she said, looking between Marcus and me with obvious tension. Marcus, what are you doing here? Seeing Sarah seemed to spark something in Marcus, a last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. His posture straightened, his voice took on the familiar tone of injured reasonableness that had been so effective in the past. Sarah, sweetheart, I've been trying to reach you for days. I know we had some misunderstandings, but I think we can work through them if we just talk honestly about what's really going on here. Misunderstandings? Sarah's voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. Is that what you call lying to me about business deals, stealing money from my mother, and threatening me when I ask questions about our finances? I never threatened you, Sarah. I was frustrated and scared about losing you, and maybe I said some things. I shouldn't have, but I would never hurt you. You know that. Do I? Because 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew a lot of things about you that turned out to be completely false. I thought I knew a man who was honest and hardworking and genuinely cared about me. Instead, I discovered someone who saw me as a means to an end, who was willing to lie to me and steal from my family to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't afford. Marcus's facade began to crack again as he realized Sarah's awareness of his deception was more complete than he'd assumed. The careful balance of admission and denial he'd probably planned to use was useless if she already knew the full scope of his betrayal. Sarah, please. Yes, I made some mistakes. Yes, I got in over my head financially and made some poor decisions. But everything I did was because I love you and wanted to give you the life you deserve. I was afraid that if you knew how much I was struggling, you'd lose respect for me. So instead of trusting me with the truth, you decided to steal from my mother and lie to my face for 3 years. How is that showing love or respect for me? Because I knew this would happen. Marcus's voice rose, and the mask of reasonableness slipped again. I knew that if you found out about my financial problems, your mother would turn you against me. I knew she'd convince you that you deserved someone better, someone who could support you without help from your family. My mother didn't turn me against you, Marcus. You did that all by yourself when you called her a cancer and plotted to steal more money from her. She didn't poison me against you. She simply stopped enabling your lies. The reference to the phone call hit Marcus like a slap. His face went white as he realized the full extent of what we knew, how long we'd been aware of his true feelings about our family. You were listening, he said, staring at me with a mixture of shock and fury. You were in the house, listening to my private phone conversation. I was delivering apple turnovers that I'd made because I thought you enjoyed them, I replied calmly. I heard you describe me as a cancer and plot to extract more money from the woman you were disparaging. Everything that's happened since then has been a natural consequence of that moment of honesty. You set me up. You manipulated the whole situation to make me look bad, to destroy my marriage, to turn Sarah against me. I created circumstances where your true character would be revealed. Whether that made you look good or bad depended entirely on who you chose to be when you thought no one was watching. Marcus turned back to Sarah, desperation clear in his voice and posture. Sarah, can't you see what's happening here? Your mother has orchestrated this entire crisis to break us up. She's been manipulating the financial situation, creating pressure, forcing me into impossible positions where I had to choose between honesty and protecting our lifestyle. Everything that's gone wrong has been a direct result of her interference. No, Marcus. Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. Everything that's gone wrong has been a direct result of your choices. My mother didn't force you to create fake business opportunities. She didn't force you to steal money from accounts she'd co-signed in good faith. She didn't force you to call her names or treat me like a commodity to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I do love you, Sarah. Despite everything that's happened, despite the way your family has tried to destroy our relationship, I still love you. We can get past this if you'll just give us a chance. What you love is the idea of me, Sarah replied. You love having a wife who comes from a wealthy family, who provides social connections and financial opportunities. You love the lifestyle my mother's generosity made possible. But you don't love me as a person, because you've never bothered to know me as a person. That's not true, isn't it? When's the last time you asked me about my work because you were genuinely interested, not because you were looking for an opening to discuss your own problems? When's the last time you remembered something I told you about my hopes or dreams that didn't involve money? When's the last time you supported me through a difficult time without calculating what that support might cost you? Marcus's silence was answer enough. Even now, facing the collapse of his marriage, he couldn't articulate what he valued about Sarah beyond her utility to his plans. "I can change," he said finally. "If you'll give me another chance, I can be the husband you deserve. I can learn to be honest, to communicate better, to build a relationship based on genuine partnership instead of manipulation and deception," Sarah finished. "Marcus, the problem isn't that you made mistakes. The problem is that your mistakes reveal fundamental character flaws that can't be fixed with promises and good intentions. You see people as resources to be exploited rather than individuals to be respected. That's not something you can change overnight, and it's not something I'm willing to wait around hoping you'll eventually address." The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus alternating between pleading, bargaining, and making veiled threats about the financial and social consequences Sarah would face if she proceeded with a divorce. He painted vivid pictures of the struggles she'd encounter as a single woman, the difficulty of finding another partner who would accept her close relationship with her mother, the social embarrassment of admitting her marriage had failed. But Sarah remained unmoved by his arguments. The woman who had once been susceptible to his charm and manipulation had been replaced by someone who could see through his tactics to the desperation and selfishness underneath. Every attempt he made to regain control only reinforced her decision to end their relationship. Finally, Marcus seemed to realize that his efforts were futile. The defeated slump returned to his shoulders, and his voice took on the flat tone of someone who had exhausted all options. "Fine," he said. "If that's what you want, I won't fight the divorce. I'll move out of the house, sign whatever papers your lawyer draws up, and stay out of your lives. But I want you to know that you're making a mistake. You're throwing away 3 years of marriage because your mother convinced you to see problems that could have been solved with communication and understanding." "I'm ending a marriage that was based on lies from the very beginning," Sarah corrected. "And I'm choosing to trust my own judgment instead of continuing to doubt myself because someone I trusted was telling me my perceptions were wrong." After Marcus left, Sarah and I sat on the porch swing Richard had built 20 years earlier, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The beauty of the morning felt almost surreal after the intensity of the confrontation we'd just endured. "Do you think he meant any of it?" Sarah asked quietly. "The apologies, the promises to change, the claims that he really does love me?" It was a question I'd been expecting, and one that deserved a thoughtful answer. "I think he believes he means it," I said carefully. "People like Marcus are often very good at convincing themselves that their actions are justified, that their feelings are genuine, that they're capable of change they have no intention of making. The problem is that his definition of love is fundamentally different from yours." "What do you mean?" "You love people by wanting what's best for them, even when that conflicts with what you want for yourself. Marcus loves people by wanting to possess them, to control them, to benefit from them. When he says he loves you, he means he doesn't want to lose access to what you represent. That's not the same thing as caring about your happiness or well-being." Sarah was quiet for a long time, processing this perspective. Finally, she spoke. "Again. I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, all the moments when something felt off, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid or overly critical. How did I let myself be fooled for so long?" "Because you're a good person who assumes other people share your values," I replied. "Because you've been raised to trust and forgive and see the best in people. Those aren't character flaws, sweetheart. They're virtues that someone took advantage of. But how do I trust my judgment in the future? How do I know I won't make the same mistakes again?" It was a fair concern, and one that many people struggled with after experiencing manipulation and emotional abuse. "By learning to trust your instincts instead of dismissing them," I said. "By setting boundaries and maintaining them even when someone you care about pushes against them. By remembering that genuine love never requires you to doubt your own perceptions or compromise your core values." As we sat there together, I felt a complex mixture of emotions about what we'd accomplished and what it had cost us. Sarah was free from a relationship that would have continued to damage her self-worth and drain her resources. Marcus's schemes had been exposed before they could cause even more financial and emotional harm. The truth about his character had been revealed through his own actions rather than accusations he could deny or explain away. But the victory felt hollow in many ways. Sarah's faith in love and marriage had been shattered. Her ability to trust, her own judgment had been undermined. The comfortable family dynamic we'd enjoyed for 3 years had been destroyed, replaced by the knowledge that someone we'd welcomed into our home had been plotting against us from the beginning. The coming months would bring practical challenges as Sarah rebuilt her life as a single woman. There would be legal proceedings to formalize the divorce, financial arrangements to protect her assets from Marcus's debts, and the emotional work of healing from betrayal and manipulation. But as I watched my daughter sitting beside me in the morning light, I saw something that gave me hope. The defeated, anxious woman who had been walking on eggshells in her own home was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more self-aware, more determined to create a life based on authenticity rather than the comfortable illusions that had nearly destroyed her. The cancer Marcus had spoken of so dismissively had indeed spread through our family. But like many cancers, its removal had been painful but necessary, clearing away diseased tissue to allow healthy growth to resume. Sarah would heal. She would learn to trust again, to love again, to build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. And this time, she would do so with the wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and choosing truth over comfortable deception. As for Marcus, his future remained uncertain. Whether he would learn from this experience or simply find new victims to manipulate remained to be seen. But that was no longer our concern. We had done what was necessary to protect ourselves, and now it was time to focus on building something better from the ruins of what we'd lost. 3 months after Marcus moved out of the house I'd helped them buy, Sarah and I established a new rhythm to our lives. She had returned to her own home, reclaiming the space that had once felt like a prison of secrets and half-truths. The divorce proceedings were moving forward smoothly, with Marcus honoring his promise to cooperate rather than contest the separation. But something was weighing on my conscience during those quiet autumn evenings when Sarah would come by for dinner or call to share details about her day. The relief in her voice when she talked about sleeping peacefully, making decisions without second-guessing herself, or simply enjoying her own company was profound. Yet I found myself struggling with questions that had no easy answers. Had I manipulated the situation as skillfully as Marcus had manipulated our family? Was my orchestrated revelation of his character fundamentally different from his orchestrated deception about his own? The methods were different, but was the underlying approach really so dissimilar? These thoughts crystallized one evening in late November when Sarah arrived for dinner, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the kind of genuine smile I hadn't seen from her in years. She looked younger somehow, as if the constant stress of navigating Marcus's demands and schemes had been aging her prematurely. "Mom, I have news," she said, settling into her chair at the kitchen table where we'd shared so many important conversations over the years. "I've been accepted into the pediatric oncology training program at Children's Hospital. It's something I've wanted to do for years, but Marcus always found reasons why the timing wasn't right or why the financial sacrifice wouldn't be worth it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had discouraged Sarah from pursuing her professional dreams while simultaneously plotting to benefit from her family's financial resources. He'd seen her ambitions as obstacles to his comfort rather than goals worthy of support. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you for pursuing what you're passionate about. The program requires a 2-year commitment, and the salary is lower than what I'm making now," she continued. "But I've been thinking about what you said regarding building a life based on authenticity rather than external expectations. This feels like the right choice. even if it means living more modestly for a while. As Sarah talked about her plans, her hopes for the future, and her excitement about working with children facing serious illnesses, I realized that my deception had served its purpose. She was free to make choices based on her own values rather than someone else's financial priorities. But that didn't resolve the ethical questions that had been troubling me for weeks. After dinner, as we sat in the living room with coffee and the remainder of the wine, I made a decision that had been forming in my mind since that confrontation on the front porch. Sarah, I need to tell you something about what really happened with Marcus, something I haven't been completely honest about. She looked up from her coffee cup with curiosity rather than alarm. After months of discovering unwelcome truths about her husband, the prospect of learning something new about the situation didn't seem to frighten her. What do you mean? I took a deep breath and began with the phone conversation I'd overheard, the moment when Marcus had called me a cancer and revealed his true feelings about our family. Sarah listened without interruption as I described the hurt and anger I'd felt, but also the calculating decision that had followed. The financial pressure you watched him struggle with over the past few months, I said carefully, wasn't entirely natural. I orchestrated a significant portion of it. Sarah's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. Orchestrated how? I explained Harold's financial independence plan, the gradual withdrawal of support that had forced Marcus to handle his own obligations, the timing designed to create maximum stress during a period when he was already vulnerable. I described how I'd used my business connections to verify the fake contracting companies, how I'd coordinated with Janet at the bank to monitor his increasingly desperate financial maneuvers. The roof repair crisis that first revealed his deception to you, I continued, feeling a knot of guilt in my stomach. I knew it was fraudulent before I agreed to help. I had already investigated the contractor and discovered the mail forwarding service. I could have exposed him immediately, but instead I used it as a teaching moment. Sarah sat in silence for a long time, processing this information. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than accusatory. So you set a trap. Yes, I did. But Sarah, the trap was designed to reveal truth, not to create deception. Everything Marcus did in response to that pressure, every lie he told, every manipulation he attempted, every abusive word he spoke to you when he felt cornered, those were his choices. I created circumstances that would reveal his character, but I didn't determine what that character would be. But you manipulated the situation just as surely as he manipulated our relationship. It was a fair point, and one I'd been wrestling with for weeks. The line between protective intervention and manipulative control was thinner than I'd wanted to acknowledge. You're right, I admitted. I used deception and strategic planning to achieve a goal I believed was in your best interest. The difference, I hope, is that my goal was to reveal truth, while his was to conceal it. But I understand if you feel betrayed by my methods. Sarah was quiet again, staring into her coffee cup as if the answers to complex moral questions might be found in its depths. When she looked up, her expression was serious but not angry. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. If you had simply told me what you overheard that day, if you had come to me immediately with the truth about Marcus calling you a cancer and plotting to get more money from you, what do you think would have happened? I'd considered this question many times over the past months. Honestly, I think you would have confronted him about it. He would have had explanations. He was frustrated and venting to a friend. He didn't really mean it. He was under financial pressure and not thinking clearly. You might have believed him, or you might have had doubts, but you wouldn't have had the overwhelming evidence of his character that you ended up with. And the financial fraud? The fake business opportunities? The theft from your accounts? Without the pressure I created, he might have been more careful about covering his tracks. He might have found subtler ways to extract money from me, or he might have simply continued the smaller deceptions indefinitely. You might have lived your entire marriage without understanding who you'd really married. Sarah nodded slowly. So you created a situation where his true nature would be impossible to hide or explain away. That was the intent, yes. But Sarah, I want you to understand that there was a significant risk in this approach. If Marcus had been a better man than I suspected, if the financial pressure had revealed strength and honesty rather than desperation and manipulation, I would have been responsible for destroying a good marriage based on a single overheard comment. But you were confident that wouldn't happen. I was confident based on patterns I'd been observing for 3 years. The way he always seemed to have financial crises at convenient times. The way he steered conversations toward his needs, while appearing to be reluctant to ask for help. The way he never seemed to develop genuine friendships or maintain long-term business relationships. But yes, there was a risk. I was wrong. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where autumn leaves were scattered, across the ground like fragments of a broken promise. When she turned back to me, her expression had shifted to something I couldn't quite read. Mom, what if I told you that you weren't the only one setting traps? The question caught me completely. Off guard. What do you mean? What if I told you that I suspected Marcus was being deceptive about our finances months before you overheard that phone call? What if I told you that I'd been conducting my own investigation into his behavior, and that I was the one who gave you the key opportunity to discover his true character? I stared at my daughter, trying to process what she was suggesting. Sarah, I don't understand. She returned to her chair, but this time she sat forward, her posture more animated than I'd seen it in months. Do you remember when I insisted, you keep a key to our house for emergencies and impromptu visits? When I made sure you knew Marcus's work schedule and which days he was likely to be home during business hours? A chill ran down my spine as I began to understand the implications of her questions. You knew I would use that key? You knew I would eventually arrive at a time when Marcus thought he was alone. I hoped you would, and I hoped that if you did, you might overhear something that would confirm the suspicions I'd been having for months but couldn't prove. The revelation was staggering. My careful manipulation of Marcus had been nothing compared to Sarah's careful manipulation of me. But why? I asked. Why not just confront him directly or ask for my help with your suspicions? Because I needed evidence, not just accusations. And because I knew that if Marcus was really the person I suspected him to be, he would be skilled enough to explain away anything I might discover on my own. I needed someone else to witness his deception, someone whose perspective he couldn't dismiss or manipulate. Sarah went on to explain how she'd been documenting inconsistencies in Marcus's stories for months. How she'd noticed that his business crises always seemed to coincide with times when I was feeling particularly generous or grateful. How his requests for financial help always came with just enough emotional manipulation to make refusal seem heartless. The fake roofing contractor wasn't his first fraudulent scheme, she said. It was just the first one I could prove. There were other fake invoices, other manufactured emergencies, other carefully constructed crises designed to extract money from you while making it seem like unfortunate circumstances rather than deliberate fraud. But Sarah, you seemed so shocked when I told you about the mail forwarding service. You seemed genuinely surprised by his deception. I was shocked by the extent of it and by how sophisticated his methods were, but I wasn't surprised that he was being deceptive. I'd suspected that for months. The pieces of a much larger puzzle began falling into place as Sarah continued her explanation. Her suggestion that we have lunch at cafes across town hadn't been about finding quiet places to talk. It had been about creating opportunities for Marcus to follow her, to reveal the controlling and surveillance behavior she suspected but couldn't prove. Her decision to ask detailed questions about his business opportunities hadn't been naive curiosity. It had been a deliberate attempt to force him to provide specifics that could be verified or debunked. Even her choice to stay with me after their confrontation hadn't been entirely spontaneous. She'd been preparing for the possibility that her marriage would end, and she'd wanted to ensure she had a safe place to go when it did. "So when you asked me to help you set a trap for Marcus," I said slowly, "you were actually setting a trap. For both of us. Not a trap exactly. More like a test. I needed to know if my suspicions about Marcus were accurate, but I also needed to know how you would respond if you discovered the truth about him. Would you enable his behavior to preserve family harmony, or would you take action to protect me even if it meant acknowledging that my marriage was a mistake?" The sophistication of Sarah's approach was breathtaking. While I had been congratulating myself on my strategic thinking and careful planning, my daughter had been orchestrating a much more complex revelation that encompassed not just Marcus's character, but my own. "The whole time I thought I was protecting you," I said. "You were actually protecting me." "We were protecting each other," Sarah corrected. "You from continued financial exploitation, me from a marriage that was slowly destroying my sense of self-worth and autonomy." I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the realization that my daughter had inherited more of her father's strategic thinking than I'd ever imagined. Richard would have been proud of her careful planning and patient execution, but he also would have been concerned about the necessity that had driven her to such measures. "Sarah, how long have you been planning this?" "In earnest? About 6 months. But I've been having doubts about Marcus for much longer than that. There were always small inconsistencies, moments when his emotions didn't quite match the situation, times when his explanations for financial problems seemed a little too convenient. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Why didn't you ask for help when you first started having suspicions?" Sarah's expression grew thoughtful, and when she answered, her voice carried a maturity that reminded me she was no longer the young woman who had married Marcus 3 years earlier. "Because I needed to be sure. Because accusations without evidence would have given him the opportunity to adjust his methods and become more careful. And because I needed to know that I could trust my own judgment, that I wasn't being paranoid or overly suspicious." The conversation continued late into the evening as Sarah revealed the full extent of her counter-investigation. She had documented every request for financial assistance, every business opportunity that had failed to materialize, every convenient crisis that had required immediate family support. She had researched his professional claims, investigated his supposed business connections, and even hired a private investigator to verify some of his more questionable stories. The investigator confirmed that Marcus had a pattern of targeting women from wealthy families, she said. "I wasn't his first victim, just his most successful one. He'd been engaged twice before to women with significant family money, but both relationships had ended when his true motives were discovered." This information hit me like a physical blow. Marcus's pursuit of Sarah hadn't been a love story that had been corrupted by greed. It had been a calculated strategy from the very beginning, a business plan that had targeted my daughter specifically because of her family's financial resources. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I'm so sorry you had to carry that knowledge alone for so long." "I wasn't entirely alone," she replied. "I had the private investigator, and I had the certainty that eventually the truth would reveal itself. I just needed to create the right circumstances for that revelation to occur." As the evening wound down and Sarah prepared to leave, I found myself grappling with a profound shift in my understanding of the past few months. The guilt I'd been carrying about manipulating Marcus and deceiving Sarah had been replaced by awe at my daughter's strength and strategic thinking. But it had also been replaced by sadness that she'd felt it necessary to conduct such an elaborate deception rather than simply asking for help. "Sarah, before you go, I need to ask you something. Do you think I failed you as a mother? Do you think I created an environment where you felt you couldn't trust me with the truth about your marriage?" She paused in putting on her coat, considering the question seriously. "Mom, you raised me to be independent, to think critically, and to trust my own judgment. You also raised me to be kind and generous, to see the best in people, and to believe that love could overcome most obstacles. Those values were both my strength and my vulnerability in dealing with Marcus. But they didn't prevent you from seeing through his deception. No, they didn't. And they didn't prevent me from taking action to protect both of us when I realized the extent of his manipulation. You didn't fail me, Mom. You gave me the tools I needed to recognize the truth and the strength to act on it. After Sarah left, I sat alone in my living room surrounded by photographs that told the story of our family's life together. Richard and me as young newlyweds, Sarah as a toddler taking her first steps, family vacations and holiday celebrations that documented decades of genuine love and support. The past few months had added new chapters to that story. Chapters that were more complex and morally ambiguous than the simple narratives of family happiness that had come before. But they were also chapters that revealed the depth of character that existed within our family, the willingness to make difficult choices in service of truth and protection of those we loved. Marcus had called me a cancer, a malignant presence that needed to be removed from his carefully constructed life. What he hadn't understood was that cancer, in the medical sense, is simply cellular growth that has lost its proper regulation and purpose. The real cancer in our family had been the deception and manipulation that had metastasized through our relationships, threatening to destroy the healthy bonds that connected us. The treatment for that cancer had been painful and invasive, requiring us to cut away diseased tissue and endure the side effects of aggressive intervention. But the result was a family that was healthier, stronger, and more honest than it had been before. Sarah had emerged from her marriage with a clearer sense of her own worth and a deeper understanding of what genuine partnership should look like. She had learned to trust her instincts, while also developing the investigative skills necessary to distinguish between suspicion and evidence. I had learned that protection sometimes requires deception, that love sometimes demands difficult choices, and that the most effective way to reveal someone's character is to create circumstances where they must choose between their own interests and the well-being of others. Most importantly, we had both learned that family isn't just about blood relations or legal bonds. It's about people who are willing to sacrifice for each other's happiness, who choose truth over comfortable illusions, and who understand that genuine love sometimes requires saying and doing difficult things. Marcus had been right about one thing. I was a kind of cancer in his carefully constructed world of deception and manipulation. I was a force that exposed lies, demanded accountability, and refused to enable behavior that damaged the people I loved. But unlike the disease he'd compared me to, this particular cancer was beneficial. It had spread through our family relationships, removing the toxic elements that threatened our well-being and strengthening the healthy connections that remained. The financial cancer I'd given Marcus had served its purpose. It had revealed his true character and protected my daughter from a lifetime of emotional and financial abuse. More importantly, it had taught us both valuable lessons about the difference between manipulation and protection, between deception that serves selfish interests and strategic action that serves love. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a sense of closure that had been absent for months. The questions about the ethics of my approach hadn't been fully resolved, but they had been placed in proper context. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses. Sometimes protection requires temporary deception. Sometimes revealing truth demands strategic thinking and careful planning. The cancer Marcus had seen in me wasn't malignant after all. It was the healthy immune response of a family that refused to be destroyed by parasitic behavior. It was the natural reaction of people who valued authentic relationships over convenient arrangements. And in the end, that cancer had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had identified the real threat to our family's well-being and eliminated it before it could cause irreparable damage. Sarah would heal. She would find love again, this time with someone who valued her for who she was rather than what she represented. she would build the career she'd always wanted and create a life based on her own values rather than someone else's expectations. The financial support I'd withdrawn from Marcus would be redirected toward causes and people who would use it honorably. The trust that had been damaged by his deception would be rebuilt on firmer foundations of honesty and mutual respect. And the lessons we'd learned about the nature of manipulation, the importance of trust, and the sometimes painful necessity of choosing truth over comfort would serve us well in all our future relationships. The cancer Marcus had feared had indeed spread throughout our family, but its effect had been curative rather than destructive, removing diseased elements and strengthening what remained. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.